when I was like talking to her about it to say, all right, tell me what makes a good editor? And she said, well, the book makes a good editor. The writer makes a good editor. It's not the editor, it's the work itself.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard Podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today, I'm excited to be back with storyboard contributor Christina M. Tapper, who has a fantastic new interview today. Christina, how are you?
Hey, Mark, what's going on? I am well.
Tell us about today's guest. Who do we have?
So I'm excited to be in conversation with Dana A. Williams. She's a professor of African American literature and dean of the graduate school at Howard University. Dana just released the book, Toni at Random, The Iconic Writer's Literary Editorship. And it's a book that Toni Morrison herself requested that Dana write. So in this episode, it's such a treat because Dana and I get to explore Toni Morrison's work behind the scenes in elevating fellow writers while also enriching American culture and driving cultural conversations beyond her own writing.
I love the conversation. How did you first get introduced to Toni Morrison's work, both as a writer and as an editor, and then also how you connected with Dana?
Toni Morrison was in my house even before I knew Toni Morrison, who she was. I actually still have the book. My mom was a part of one of those random membership book clubs. And I remember the first book that I saw in our home was Paradise. So that's how I was first introduced to her. I would say that I started reading her in college though. Mm-hmm. And I would say my favorite Toni Morrison book that Toni Morrison wrote was Sula. I could go on and on about that book, but I won't right now. And then I was introduced to Toni Morrison's editorship when I saw the documentary on her, The Pieces I Am, back in 2019. And there were mentions about her editing the autobiographies of Angela Davis and Muhammad Ali. And a couple of years later, when I was an editor at Zora, we published a story about Morrison's editing and her influence on Black writers and the publishing world. That piece was written by Ariel Gray. And Dana Williams, who I'm in conversation with today, was quoted in it. Mm. And since then, I've been on a search to learn more about Morrison, the editor. And so I'm so happy that Dana is giving us a deeper look into that part of Morrison's career that's often ignored and underexplored, especially given the magnitude of Morrison's writing career.
Yeah, and it's so great that Dana had direct access to Toni Morrison.
Yes.
And then also access to this immense archives, both from Toni Morrison and from the writers who she worked with. What struck you about her process in putting this book together?
Well, I love that she was committed to the due diligence and the accuracy. So you mentioned the archives. She wasn't just, settling into one archive. She was going to multiple archives. So the Toni Morrison Archive in Princeton, as well as the Random House Archive here in New York, where I'm based at Columbia. And also some of the archives of the writers that Toni Morrison edited, like Toni Cade Bambara, whose archive is at Spelman down in Atlanta. And so I particularly appreciate that part of it. And also, in this conversation with Dana, I appreciate her being very candid about the challenges in her process of transitioning from academic writing to narrative prose writing, and how, she had to break out of her standard way of writing, and that really stretched her, but it also allowed her to deliver a really incredible book.
I love this conversation, so let's get to it. Without further ado, here's Christina's conversation with Dana A. Williams.
Dana, thank you so much for joining me on the Nieman Storyboard Podcast. Major congrats on the book, Toni at Random.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. Okay, there's so much that I want to get into about your research and writing and Toni Morrison's advocacy and craft as an editor. But first, I want to start with the title of the book, Toni at Random, which came out of a conversation that you had with Morrison at a New Year's Day gathering.
Yes.
And yeah, so by that point, you had already an established relationship and trust with Morrison. Take us back to that moment at that gathering when she asked you about the progress of the book and how that conversation evolved into a discussion about the book title.
Yeah, it's funny now, but I can tell you it was not funny then. I had been working on the book for many years, and she had been incredibly generous with her time and really supportive, and I knew that it was likely that she would be there, and we were at Eleanor Traylor's house, and Eleanor always has an open house for New Year's Day, and all of the who's who in literature would be there, in part because her function as a gatherer was just really that strong. So I walk into the house and she, says, oh, go upstairs and have something to eat. But I can tell by the way that she says it that I'm going to be somewhat surprised. So I'm also in this really interesting place of trying to avoid Ms. Morrison instead of being really excited that there's every opportunity I get to, really engage and to see what's happening, because I haven't made as much progress on the book as I would have liked, and she had been so generous. So I thought, what can salvage this? And I said, well, I do have a title. And in an earlier interview, we had talked about how incredibly difficult titles are, how they make and break a book. Because that's the first thing that people see. Of course, they see the cover, but then they also want to know, what's this really intriguing cover? So I knew how important titles were. So I'm approaching and I'm like, Happy New Year. How are things going? Did you have a good holiday season? And she lets me make this small talk until ultimately she's like, so how's it going? And as a writer, she was gentle. And I said, well, I'm not making as much progress as I would want to. Things are a little bit slower, but I have this title. I finally got the title, and things are going to gel because you get the title and you know where you're going. And I say, The House That Toni Built at Random, which I think is really smart because it's like Toni Morrison, Random House, Morrison building a house. This is it. And she goes, smart, but too long. So now my one little celebration also seems to be devastated, and she says, Toni at Random. And I go, Toni at Random. And she thinks, and I think, and we kind of do this thing. And I also say, well, I don't know, can I call you Toni? And she says, well, Chloe at Random, no one would get it, So I could appreciate also the humor and also the just real kind of, I'm thinking through this with you without imposing. So The House That Toni Built at Random, keeping with that, but then saying Toni at Random, just short, people would get it. A little bit later, it was interesting to think about it because it's an insider's title. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to fight hard for the title because it was collaboratively established. And to my surprise, my editorial team didn't argue with me at all once I told them the story. And they said, well, we'll work on the subtitle. And then Abby West really just almost magically came up with the subtitle, The Iconic Writer's Literary Editorship, to take it from being an insider's title into something that everybody could bring into. And then, of course, the image of Morrison on the cover, dead center looking the reader in the eye, helps.
I love that whole story, and I also know Abby West. I actually want to talk to you about, the writer-editor relationship you have. We'll get to that soon. What a great anecdote there to start with, but also I love that you came into the conversation okay, I got something good for you.
I'm ready.
And Morrison was like,
let's.
You're right, but it also speaks to the fact that she took some time to workshop that with you, right? Mm-hmm. And I love that you put this anecdote also in the acknowledgments, and there's a part where you mention that you two are repeating the title over and over. And it reminds me of what poet Nikki Finney says, which is repetition is holy. So that's just a beautiful moment between you two. But let's start at the beginning. How did you meet Toni Morrison, and how did your relationship develop to a point where you're in the position to actually write this book and have her request that you write this book?
So, like so many people, I read Morrison first. before I encountered her in person. I had read Morrison before graduate school, but then by the time I got to graduate school, we had probably done all of the books that she had written up until that point in some variation of a class. And each year at Howard, for many of the years that Eleanor Traylor was chair, she had a February event where she brought in a literary luminary at a day we called Hearts Day. And one year we were celebrating Miss Morrison for Hearts Day, and that was probably the first time that I met her where we exchanged words. I had been to readings before, but this kind of intimacy that is made possible when a writer comes to campus and can engage with people more on the one-on-one is probably the time that stands out to me the most. And there was a graduate seminar that I was taking with Dr. Traylor on the writers whose fiction Morrison edited. And I admit my bias towards fiction. I did some early work in my master's degree program on Black women playwrights, and I was convinced I was going to be either a dramaturg or a theater critic. And then the more I read the fiction, the more I saw the work that the fiction could do and its accessibility to people beyond what happens on the stage. So many people don't get to go to plays, and plays happen far more infrequently as books. So then I shifted my attention a bit to fiction. So when I had the opportunity to take this class that was on these fiction writers, some of whom I was familiar with, but others of whom I was not, and I remember Dr. Traylor saying at the beginning of the semester, these are the fiction writers that Toni Morrison edited when she was at Random House. And I thought Toni Morrison was an editor. I didn't even know Toni Morrison was an editor. And I certainly didn't know that she had worked on a number of writers outside of the fiction. So that's really how the project began. At the end of the semester, it was clear that this was going to be a dissertation project for me. So I go and I say, I'm ready for my dissertation proposal, and I'm going to do my dissertation on all of these writers that she focused on, well, the Black writers of fiction: Toni Cade Bambara, Leon Forrest, Henry Dumas, John McCluskey, and Gayl Jones. And somehow I thought I could do a chapter on each and wrap this thing up neatly in a bow. And, I was naive. I was young. I thought that, it was completely possible. And Dr. T said, no, you can't do that. That's going to take too long. Like, save that for a bigger project. Like, pick one of the writers. And then I thought, I'll pick Toni Cade Bambara. And she said, somebody's working on a Bambara book. You should do Leon Forrest, because there is no book on Leon Forrest, and he is just this magical writer. And I thought, well, that's the hardest, because there's not enough scholarship on Forrest for me to be able to build on. And as a kind of emerging scholar, I wanted the benefit of reliance on someone else. And so it was at that moment that she says, no, the work that we do at Howard is intervention. You're going to intervene in the field. You are going to do this book on Forrest because there is no book on Forrest, and then you can get to the editorship, because we're not doing what everybody else is doing. And I had heard that for 4 years, nonstop at Howard. Like, we do what other people don't do. We have the benefit of 8 faculty working in African American literature, where at best another department may have 2 or 3. Like, you get to have the full range. Like, we don't do what everybody else does. So I didn't really have a choice. So I then began to work on Forrest. I work on the Forrest book, which ultimately I think becomes a serious benefit to establishing trust with Miss Morrison, in addition to she and Eleanor being very close friends and Eleanor giving me the green light. But I had gone to Northwestern for a year on a postdoc, and then there was the Forrest lecture shortly after he had made transition, had become an ancestor, and Morrison gave that lecture. So as she's talking about Leon Forrest, and here I am, someone who's a visitor, but who's also a postdoc, who's working on Forrest, who knows all of the works backwards and forwards, inside out. I had finished the book. And so I think that gave her the level of confidence that this is a very serious person, and I can have a real conversation with her. And I kind of jokingly talk about the fact how she said, oh, just sit down right here. And I thought, I know what it's like to plan an event, and people have painstakingly made decisions about who's sitting where, and everybody wants a prize seat. And so for her to just say, plop down right here, I thought, I'm sorry to whoever's like complete table setting I'm messing up, but I'm not passing up this opportunity to be clear about what it is that I want to work on ultimately. That the Forrest work was done, but I was really interested in thinking about the role she had played as an editor. At the time, I was really thinking about the book as her work as a midwife for contemporary African American fiction. I wasn't thinking about it from the broad perspective of everything that she had edited. And it took 2 or 3 conversations with her for her to subtly make suggestions that the editorship was much larger than the fiction. And I finally caught up to where she was very early on in the conversation.
And please share the title of the Leon Forrest book that you worked on.
In the Light of Likeness Transformed. And that's a quote from Leon Forrest where he talks about that there is this light of likeness, but you have to transform it. So that's the quoted, and then the subtitle is The Literary Art of Leon Forrest.
It's beautiful that you landed on Leon Forrest, and that was a way of your trajectory to even getting to this point, along with the help and advocacy of Dr. Eleanor Traylor.
It was also a lesson with Forrest to not allow the growth that was happening for me intellectually to stop me from engaging. Because I had Leon Forrest's email address, I had a couple of points of contact, but I just thought, I don't know enough yet to have a conversation with him. I did not know at the time that he was had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I didn't know that he was making his transition. So I put it off and put it off and put it off. And so once I did finally make contact with his widow, and she was the most generous person, just incredibly giving, as were the people in African American studies whom he had worked with at Northwestern, that I thought, I won't let timidity do this to me again. So that too kind of really fueled my willingness to engage Morrison, to say, I really do know what I'm doing, and you really can't trust me. I don't know as much as you do, but I know what I'm doing. I am an expert in this field.
That's a great lesson, because you can't be.
It is.
You can't be timid around Morrison.
No.
You just can't, right?
You cannot. And you also have to be willing to accept where she is on any given moment. There were some times when she was incredibly generative, and there were other times when she clearly had some other things that she was wanting to do. And so I had to learn, you let the story go where it will. And trust that when she says we can talk more later, that you'll have that opportunity to talk more later. Because the first time that we met to talk about the book in her office in Princeton, she knew I'm working on these 5 Black writers, I'm working on this fiction, and she didn't talk about a single one of them. She talked about everything else, and I thought, oh boy, I don't know how this is gonna work out. And then, at the end she goes, and if I can be helpful, let's just set up some more time. I'm glad you're working on this. I really want people to understand what happened in the editorship. And I'm thinking to myself, do you really? Because I asked you some pointed questions and you pointed me in different directions. But again, that was, I think, a part of her subtle way of saying, this isn't just about the fiction, this is the bigger conversation. So I ended up conceding, interestingly enough, that this was going to be a bigger book than what I had initially thought.
Toni Morrison was quietly editing you. You didn't even know.
I did not even know. I did not know.
So, as we know, a lot has been written about and said about Morrison's prolific career as a writer, and your book helps us understand Morrison's influence beyond her own authorship. So I want to set the table here with some bullet points that are on Morrison's resume, but that we don't often talk about. So chime in here, Dana, on this kind of the vitals, or as we like to call the receipts, right? So
yes.
Morrison edited more than 50 titles at Random House between the early 1970s and 1984. As an editor, she elevated the voices and stories of Toni Cade Bambara, Leon Forrest, Lucille Clifton, Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, Muhammad Ali, and many others. And she worked across genres, including cookbooks. But much of what I just mentioned is not known and very much underexplored until your book came along. How did you arrive at this idea that you wanted to publish a book about Morrison's legacy as an editor? I'd like you to elaborate on what you've already shared, but at what point were you were like, this is a book I must do, despite the fact of, you mentioned in the book, the overwhelming obligations that were impeding your time to dedicate time to this book?
Yep, I think I can trace it almost directly to the day I finished reading Larry Jackson's Indignant Generation. There is a friend, I might have read some of the book in draft, but that book made me say, African American literary history needs all of our attention. we don't focus as much on how books come to be, how reviews come about, how editors engage and make or break support, like how publishers, there was so much in African American literary history that we just don't know enough about. And it also means that we aren't trained to think about it. Like, we look at the finished product. We don't look at like the behind the scenes, like how the sausage is made. And even as I recognized that I wanted to think about those fiction writers, I was still focusing on the fiction itself. I wasn't even thinking about the writers until I finished, I think, reading The Indignant Generation, and I thought, all right, here's a book where the messiness is okay. Everything's not tied up into this really neat bow. There is no central thesis. And I remember one of the first times I presented, like internally in the department, we would have these talks in the Department of English at Howard. And I remember a colleague saying, yeah, but what's your argument? And I remember thinking, I don't really have an argument. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what argument am I going to make. But then I read Indignant Generation. It's like, books don't have to have arguments. Books can teach us and allow people to come to some level of understanding and to construct arguments for themselves. Like, those are as valuable contributions to the field. And Indignant Generation did that for me. So that's when I said, okay, I can write this messy book. Coming up with, like, how will the chapters be broken? I can't do it chronologically because she may have contracted a book in 1971 that doesn't come out until 1975. There are books that were done where all of her correspondence is in 1973, but she holds one book because she can't release them both at the same time because, you know, one of the books will ultimately get the short shrift. So there were no really neat, clean ways to talk about it. As you mentioned, like, they're different genres. So I can't just say, all right, we're going to talk about the fiction for the first half of the book, and then we're going to talk about the nonfiction. Well, what do you do with the Black book? What do you do with this book on trains? What do you do with these books by white women, America's working women, and the lesbian myth? So once I accepted that this book, the thread was going to be about the work of an editor, then it all seemed to come together a whole lot more neatly. I think if I had been working on it exclusively, I would have come to it a lot faster, but I was stealing time from being chair of the department. I was stealing time from my work with the College Language Association as its president. I was on literary history or literary committees or cultural arts committees because institution building is just so incredibly important to me. I was also invested completely in my graduate students because I had been invested in so much as a graduate student. So in the way that scholars are usually able to step outside of all of that and just kind of think through what structure will look like, I was like, yeah, I got to sneak to the archive to try to figure out what's going on with this Muhammad Ali contract. Or I got to pick up a thread that she mentioned in passing about a book, but that I don't know very much about. And that was the case with contemporary African literature. She pulled the book off the shelf and she shows it to me and she says, have you seen this book? It's beautiful. And I had not seen contemporary African literature as an anthology, in part because we also had the benefit at Howard of having an African Studies department and an Afro-American Studies department and an English department and a history department, all of which are focusing on Africa and African diaspora, right? So I don't have to know African literature in the way that I would somewhere else because we got folks who are specializing in that very specifically. So I didn't know the book. I had heard of the editors from some other kind of conversation, but I say that to say I'm now chasing threads from this place to this place. And then I'm also maturing intellectually in a way that I think I'm satisfied now that the book came out at the time that it was supposed to come out because it's so much of a smarter book than it would have been 10, 15 years ago. I feel that way in some ways about the Forrest book, that I would write a different book, but I also had learned, remember, like, don't hold a thing until you're like so sure about the thing because you don't know what will happen. So I'm okay with it having taken as long with those competing interests. I wouldn't trade the institution building work that I have done for anything in the world. If it meant that it would be 4 or 5 more years before this book would come out, if I could find ways to make sure the Hurston Wright Foundation, the College Language Association, the Toni Morrison Society. All of those things are stronger, I think, because of some of the investments that I was able to make along with others. So I'm satisfied. I admit, though, I'm glad that it's done. I am disappointed, I guess, in some ways that she didn't get a chance to see it, but I think she knew what it was going to be.
And that she trusted you.
Absolutely.
That
was probably the most important.
Yes, yes. And I'm a firm believer, everything in its time. So your book is right on time, Dana. Right on time.
I'm going to trust that. Yes.
Yes. So from your research, how would you describe Morrison's craft and style as an editor, especially because she worked across genres and managed many different personalities across her roster of writers?
It varied too, and I think that speaks to that kind of neatness thing that I was going for when I was like talking to her about it, to say, all right, tell me what makes a good editor? And she said, well, the book makes a good editor. The writer makes a good editor. It's not the editor, it's the work itself. Now, what I can do to make it better varies from book to book, editor to editor. There were some writers, when she talked about Toni Cade Bambara, she said, like, my only job with Bambara was to make sure that the story held together and that she wasn't leaving the reader behind. She would joke about Bambara moving so fast that if the reader didn't keep up, then the reader just got lost. So sometimes it would be slowing her down, adding a sentence or two to say, give the reader some time to process this. And interestingly enough, I didn't know it at the time, but I think that was a function of Morrison's work in the theater. The time that she spent at Howard that she talked about most positively was as an actor herself. And one of the techniques, of course, for playwrights is if there's a line that punches, you have to give the audience an opportunity to pause to catch before you move to the next line that will have some type of impact. So there has to be this kind of throwaway line. So I think her work as an editor with Bambara was informed by, listen, you got to give the audience time to catch up. Even as you're reading, if you're reading fast, you'll miss it. That was something that she didn't have to do with Leon Forrest. With Leon Forrest, it was, Leon, you've used these words too many times in the same paragraph, and you have used too many words. And she says it absolutely must be cut. Like this dream sequence has gone on for 4 pages and it should be 2 pages. Then with somebody like Muhammad Ali, it was really motivation and inspiration directly with the writer who was working with Ali. So it changed from place to place, but the thing that I think centralized or was true for every book, no matter what, was clarify whatever the point that you're trying to make. So if there's a theme in fiction, be sure that it's there. Be sure that all of the stories either hang together or there are no uncertainties about a character. Can we believe this character is what she would talk about with Gayl Jones quite often. Like, we don't know enough about Ursa's motivation to believe what happens at the end, so fill this out. So there were always clarifying questions. And then there was the post-manuscript completion moment that we don't talk about or think about enough in terms of promotion. A really good editor makes sure that the book gets in the hands of the right people. And I think she was probably better at that than most people.
I would love for you to talk a little bit about book titles. When we talk about Toni Cade Bambara being edited by Toni Morrison, one of the books is Gorilla My Love. They also worked together on Salt Eaters, which is one that Toni Cade Bambara is especially known for. A very young Gayl Jones worked with Toni Morrison on how many books? I believe it was
Corregidora, Eva's Man, and White Rat. She actually started on what gets published as Palmera's maybe 5-6 years ago.
Right.
They were working on that manuscript together, but their editor-author relationship was so frayed once Jones married her husband, and he actually asks Morrison for a sample of her work as an editor, and you can only imagine how that ended.
And you know, your book has tea, Dana. Your book has tea, okay? Because you set me up for my next question, because when I'm reading this book, sometimes my jaw was left open with some of the indignities that Toni Morrison had to endure. You surface a lot of correspondence because you were deep in the archives. So I want to toggle between a bunch of questions here, but because I want to get back to the expansion of an editor's duties, because we were talking about marketing, book covers. So I want to get back to that. But since we're here with the tea, we know that friction exists between editors and writers. We're talking about literary art, so that's very commonplace. But what did you learn about Morrison's ability to navigate friction and still get the work done, even as a writer hangs up on her during a heated telephone conversation, or another writer accuses Morrison of being, quote, trapped in the mentality of white publishing? What did you learn about Morrison and how she moved through and past these moments?
The thing that she tells to Chinwezu, who was the person who hung up on her, is the thing that resonates the most with me. And we talked about this. She writes to him not to worry, that she cannot stay mad at people, only institutions. And I think that informed the way that she interacted with people, whether or not they were 100% kind. And she had this incredible relationship with Toni Cade Bambara, which was complicated for me as a researcher, because often Bambara was writing so fast and editing so fast, like they didn't do the correspondence, and Bambara would stay with her for a couple of days to finish the book because, you know, she was just across the bridge. Or so for me as a researcher, I'm like, there's no correspondence. Like they were doing it in real time. It was tragic to me, but also very clear that they had this beautiful convivial relationship. But her interaction with writers and with other people in a general sense was, we don't have to agree. If we have a similar type of motivation toward honoring the culture in some way, it's fine. There will be disagreements, but in the end, it's structures that I don't forgive or that I can't bridge a gap. There were, oftentimes when she would have to think twice about whether or not she wanted to work with another writer or not for another project. And even if there had been like some difficulties, and she, interestingly enough, would say, all right, now that our author-editor relationship has been tested, she said that at least 3 times with people. So there was this fundamental sense that the author-editor relationship will be tested. But I appreciated that she didn't take any of it personally. As a writer, she knew that there wouldn't always be like kind of clear paths forward, or that there would not be disagreements from time to time. So I think it informed her work as an editor, and just the respect that she had for her writers comes through very clearly as well.
So much so that, we're talking about her extension of editor duties and how she's so deliberate in having a hand in the marketing and book covers, and even setting up accessibility in terms of book clubs that center Black readers. So I'd love for you to talk about that part of Toni Morrison's editorship, where it goes well beyond line editing.
Yeah, that again, I think is some of the strength of her editorship, knowing audience and knowing how to build an audience for a book. And then also just like being curious and in some ways imposing enough to go to the design team to say, no, that cover won't work. And I tell you, Christina, I just cracked up at myself when I got the first copy of the cover for this book. I was like, no, and no. And I thought, oh man, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is like, I'm that author now. I cannot believe it. But yes. I had in my mind what I thought the cover should look like. And I probably should have said something right away. I didn't. They were just like, hey, we're going to send you some covers. So she would work with the copy team or the design team to say, this is what this cover needs to look like. Because I think she thought she knew better than the designers who weren't in the bookstores in the same way, who weren't hearing from people to make decisions about what would make a reader want to pick this up. And that was always the objective. The goal of the cover had to be, a reader sees this book in a window somewhere, and they want to pick the book up and flip through it to figure out what's inside. So the cover was critical. She wouldn't leave it to chance. And Overwhelmingly, I think that was the case with the Black books that she worked on. It was the case with other books kind of more generally, but for sure with the books by Black women writers, where she would have to say, nope, the last Black woman writer I did, a book that just came out not too long ago, had a purple cover. I can't do another purple cover this soon because people will inevitably, like it'll be a washout. And she wasn't thinking of an exclusively Black audience for books, but she certainly was thinking about a Black audience for books. The typeset, I mean, the correspondence that says, I want this book set the same way this book was set. I mean, the level of detail was really, really, really remarkable. Then what types of kind of networking she had to do to make sure that the book got to the right reviewer. You would see her advocating for her authors as strongly as she was advocating for herself. If she had a book that was out, she was also trying to make sure that the book that she was working on by another author was being promoted at the same time. There was a time when Song of Solomon, which was really her breakout book, when Song of Solomon speaking engagements came, she was really working on a couple of books at the same time. So she would be doing promotions of Gayl Jones, promotions for the Black book. And there was this kind of unselfishness because another thing that she said that I think resonates with writers that I hadn't heard another writer say until I was talking to Ta-Nehisi about, nobody wants to be in this thing alone.
Right. You're speaking of
she
Ta-Nehisi
didn't want
Coates.
to be
Yes.
the only one. Yes.
Right.
Like nobody wants to be alone.
Right.
Like you want other people to be on this ride with you. You don't want to be the only one. And you know that it's possible for there to be space for multiple people. So you're really trying to promote other people as well.
Yes, yes. Building that community. Toni Morrison was an exceptional writer, but she wasn't the only one. And she wanted she wanted to share all of that with others. I found it so fascinating too, just by reading your book, finding out about how she was trying to figure out the pacing of books, making sure that enough time had passed between two books so they wouldn't be pitted against each other or lumped together. Or even when I think it's the Angela Davis chapter of your book, when Toni Morrison is editing the autobiography of Angela Davis, where she's figuring out the book club situation so that, and requesting that Random House give I think it was a 40% discount on books, and that Black book, the hosts of these book clubs or book gatherings could actually pocket the difference in selling the book. So also just like thinking about this in the most robust way where like everyone wins, right?
Yes. There was an instance with Creole Feast, the cookbook, where the chefs who contribute to the cookbook are also trying to form a union because they've been paid under the table their whole lives, and now they're getting older and they're thinking about Social Security and being able to retire. And Dr. Burton, who organizes these chefs, is determined to start a union for them. And so she's advocating with Random House to give them their next payment because waiting for 30 more days means that they can't form this union. So it really was more than just, I want this book in the world. It's like, I want people to be okay. I want people to have the most access in terms of sales. I want to make sure that some profit can be made by the people who are trying to do some advocacy, that Black books deserved book parties, which, wasn't the standard. And there's some difference between the way Random House handled the acquisition of books and the marketing and promotion of books differently from some of the other places. And in many instances, it was better at Random House, but still she had to advocate to make sure that there were parties that would celebrate the book, that would create the hype so that she could invite someone in so that it would get reviewed in all the right places. Because she was clear as a writer, had it not been for the adoption of the Bluest Eye onto syllabi all over the city of New York system, that book doesn't take off the way that it does. It was, it was like a good book at Holt Rinehart that was just okay, but wasn't going to a second, third, fourth, fifth printing. So I think her awareness of the politics of bookmaking and her kind of curiosity around it helped her to say, okay, if that's what it takes to make an impactful editor and then an impactful engagement with the audience, I'll do that, because she was also always looking at her profit and loss sheet. And would use that for her argument, especially with writers. Like, she loves Leon Forrest, and she knew Leon Forrest wasn't selling books, but she's like, it's such a beautiful book and it's really important to do the art. So she would take full advantage of Random House's kind of reputation of being an arts house as opposed to pure profit. Like, you make your books off of your money off of dictionaries, but then she would also look at her profit and loss sheet and say, listen, I've done enough books that made enough money. Leave me alone to do the books that I want to do. Yeah.
That is just the brilliance of Toni Morrison. And I love that you shared the anecdote about the Creole Feast authors that's highlighted in the book with the correspondence, where literally the request for the advance from Toni to say, like, hey, these guys, they need the money and this union might fall apart. They can't wait till August, so can we give the money early? And a lot of that, the correspondence in your book, is from the archive. So I'm so curious, how did you work with the archives, specifically Toni Morrison's archives? But I know you also dug into the archives of many of the writers that she worked with. So what was the process like working with all of the archives?
Tedious, but also rewarding. Lots of fun, but also kind of rabbit hole-ish. I don't even know if there's a word. There's a word.
Listen,
for it,
you just made it. You
Yes.
made it a word. Yes.
You would see something and you say, so, and it comes up like in the weirdest kinds of places. There's this piece of correspondence about her interpretation or her dissatisfaction with like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So then I go to try to figure out what was the edition of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that she's working on. And I go like, wait, this doesn't have anything to do. She didn't publish that. And somebody did a piece a couple of years ago about Morrison's rejection letters. So it was that kind of thing. I was like, the rejection letters are as interesting as the acceptances. I wish, I know now, and I'll probably teach this in future seminars where I talk about working in the archive. I wish I had known that my first task should have been a timeline. I would have like determined like what kind of metadata I wanted to be able to search and to find things. If she had in correspondence that she met with James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, and let's say Stokely Carmichael, we had a conversation about blank over lunch, whatever. I wanted to go to her expense receipts to see where they went, to see where that restaurant was, to try to build the ambiance. I mean, it was like you have to stop yourself. So in most instances, you would see her copy of the letter that she wrote, and then you would see the letter that whoever responded. The way that the archive is now at Columbia, it's not in chronological order. It's just all there. And there are so many boxes, they would never be able to put it in chronological order except over like a long period of time. So what I ultimately did, because they do let you make copies or they let you take images, and then I have to work from print. I'm old school, I can't do digital. So then I had to print the images every time. And then I would try to order it based on dates so that I could tell a story. Because you may see something from July 1st, 1972, and then you don't find the corresponding piece for it until 8 boxes later when she's talking about it that's relevant to another book. So it gets filed in that book's category, but it's also relevant to this. There's no cross-listing going on. So I had to spend a lot of time trying to make stories. And then I think what was also a challenge for me is really making decisions about when the correspondence needed to speak for itself, and I needed to include the correspondence and not have it be too correspondence heavy, and when I had full confidence that I knew this story the right way. It was much easier when she was still alive and I could say, hey, just saw so-and-so, like explain this to me, and we could talk through it. So those were easier for me to be confident about. But by the time she had made transition and I was discovering things that were ambiguous, where we had talked about, is this book on your list? And she's like, no, this book isn't on my list, but I'm looking like, hey, I see like lots of correspondence here that's yours. So like, tell me the story about why this book shouldn't be yours. Oh, somebody else acquired it and I picked it up after the fact. Okay. But if I couldn't work it out, then I let the correspondent speak. And so that was a dance for me. I didn't want to rely too heavily on it, but there were some things that you just cannot paraphrase. Like some of the language, some of what comes out in terms of her personality. I'm like, oh, you have to hear this directly from her. Like, my paraphrasing this won't do this the service. It'll be a disservice if I don't quote this directly.
Well, I do want you to read a little bit from the book and a little bit of Toni's words. But before we get into that, I just want to also just clarify. So the archives, Toni Morrison's archives, are they split between Columbia and Princeton?
So Morrison's archives are at Princeton, and I use them to fill in gaps. The Random House archives are at Columbia.
I see. Okay.
And so I worked primarily in the Random House collection because they're filed based on who the editor was. So I looked at all of the editorial Morrison files, and then they have all of the expense files. And so you would have to go to the expense files, Toni Morrison, and then they have all of the book manuscripts, all separate. So when I'm trying to figure out what her comments were directly on the page for Toni Cade Bambara. So I would go to the Bambara manuscripts, see what the comments were, but then I also had to go to Spelman to look at Bambara's archive, which is there, to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, because my obsession was there was going to be some glaring hole, some big mistake that I made that I couldn't live with myself on. And at this point, I just decided, when we were doing copy for the book and they said this comprehensive, and I was like, no, let's call it ambitious. It's not comprehensive. Like, that is the only thing that I can say, that every archive that was available to me, I tried to get to. And I'm trying to think of, I don't know that there was one that I did not. I think because I did the June Jordan at Harvard, I did, like, everybody who had an archive somewhere, I went to make sure that there wasn't anything that I was missing. Even during COVID, the folks at Texas State, I think, like, they sent me everything. So I was able to see it, but still there may be something. So I just say this is an ambitious attempt to talk about Morrison's editorial work. I can't call it comprehensive even now.
Yes. Well, appreciate you doing your due diligence and trying to be as accurate as possible, and not leaving this up to chance, right? And you mentioned June Jordan, who was also edited by Toni Morrison, poet. And so I want to shift back to Morrison's relationships with her writers. And she had some beautiful creative partnerships with writers like the other Toni Cade Bambara, as we've mentioned, poet Lucille Clifton and Angela Davis. And to highlight this, I would love for you, Dana, to read from chapter 7, The Two Tonis, which I absolutely love the title of this chapter. And just to set you up, this speaks to the way that Morrison approached editing. So the floor is yours.
On one of the few occasions, Morrison spoke explicitly and at length in print about what her work as an editor entailed. She described the work this way. Editing sometimes requires restricting, setting loose, or nailing down. Paragraphs, pages may need rewriting. Sentences, especially final or opening ones, may need to be deleted or recast. Incomplete images or thoughts may need expansion, development. Sometimes the point is buried or too worked up. Other times the tone is off, the voice is wrong or unforthcoming, or so self-regarding it distorts or misshapes the characters it wishes to display. In some manuscripts, traps are laid so the reader is sandbagged into focusing on the author's superior gifts or knowledge rather than the intimate, reader-personalized world fiction can summon. None of this editorial work was necessary with Bambara as author, Morrison noted. Quite the contrary. Entering her prose with a red pencil must be delicate. One ill-advised or well-advised correction can dislodge a thread, unravel an intricate pattern that is deceptively uncomplicated at first glance, but only at first glance. Bambara appreciated that delicacy from her friend and editor. In one letter, she slowed down long enough to say so. Occurs to me I need an agent. I realize I expect load an awful lot on you, Toni, And while I thoroughly, deeply appreciate your beyond the call of duty support, I mean, damn, TCB, lighten up. In case you didn't know, you are a superb editor. I've just checked off items in the middle of your page 2, middle of my page 300 or something, and cracking up, laughing rather than raving over your shorthand language. Perfect. Thank you, Toni. Really, truly, truly.
Thank you for reading that.
I enjoyed Toni Cade Bambara so much. For all of the reasons that you can imagine, her being a beautiful writer, but just the relationship between the two of them. One of the things that I didn't include there is a letter between the two of them, and Bambara is teaching somewhere. She's invited Morrison down to give a lecture, and she says, bring a hooker outfit. Ain't no men's up here, but still, bring a hooker outfit. So their relationship, she's like, ain't no man, but we're gonna dress up for ourselves, you know? Just in case. Yeah.
Dina, I said your book had tea. Now I'm wondering about all the tea that was left on the cutting room
B-roll.
floor.
Yes.
We're going to have to talk offline about that.
I had to cut 15,000 words because we were trying to keep it under a certain price point. So there are a couple of things that I, like there was one chapter that I lifted out completely that I will probably place somewhere else. It's on Morrison and the complicated relationship of editing white women. That was just really, because she thought that she needed to do it. There was tension because she had written that piece, What the Black Woman Thinks About White Women's Lib. So it was important for her to do. But I'm telling you, the B-roll is just so, it's almost as fascinating. I kept thinking, I can't cut this. And working with Abby and Michaela to try to figure out, like, what can we keep in a whole place that we can put somewhere else, and what do we need to be able to kind of talk around. It's just like really fascinating. But Toni Cade Bambara, let's focus. Yeah, she and Bambara had this wonderful relationship, and Morrison liked her enough to do most of her agent work for her. So at this point in this piece of correspondence, that's why Bambara is saying, like, listen, I ask a lot of you. This is kind of ridiculous. Or at the point that Morrison has somebody typing for Bambara because Bambara's typist is pregnant, and she's just had moved to Atlanta, and she's like, once I get all of these needy people away from my door, I will be able to do some stuff. So they had this really wonderful, beautiful relationship, and I think it comes across with Morrison saying, like, here are all of the things I have to do as an editor, but with Toni Cade Bambara, I just need to leave it alone to make sure that I didn't pull a thread that made the whole thing fall apart. Her job was to keep it together. One of the few things that she was willing to do after she left as editor, she does Nettie Jones. Interesting enough, we were talking about her kind of continued relationship with people after some difficulty, and she had actually stopped editing Gayl Jones, but the only reason she takes on Nettie Jones is because she's Gayl Jones' student. Only reason. So even as the relationship with Gayl Jones is strained, she's always trying to keep her ear to the ground to figure out where Jones is. And it's not a personal difficulty between the two of them. She understands, like, the vulnerability, but she's still looking for ways to be supportive. So as that last, she's like, okay, I'm not editing anybody else. I'm not taking on any new writers. I'm just going to try to wrap up those writers that I have under contract already. She takes on Nettie Jones, and then, of course, takes on Toni Cade Bambara after Bambara's death for that novel that they had really been trying to work on.
This is such a great conversation, one that I've been looking forward to, because as an editor, I have really been fascinated about Toni Morrison's editorship since I really came to realize that she was really getting down as an editor with these writers from her documentary, The Pieces I Am.
Yes.
Because, you know, Angela Davis is a part of that documentary, and reading in your book, it's interesting to see how Morrison guided a young writer like Angela Davis after Davis's trial, really guiding her with direct and measured feedback when they worked on the autobiography of Angela Davis. And there were times when Morrison would tell Davis that sections felt too academic or read too academic. And as I was reading that, I thought about my own experiences editing academic writers when I was an editor at Zora and guiding them in a writing style that's meant for a different audience. So as an academic yourself, how did you break out of your typical writing style and transition into narrative prose for this book? What was that process like?
That was the hardest of all things. I can stand in an archive from the moment they open until the moment they close. I can leave the rare reading room and go downstairs and stay in the library in Columbia and kind of like get my thoughts out until the library closes or until I'm getting ready to see a show. I mean, there are a million things that I could do. I could figure out how I was going to pay for travel under some difficult circumstances. Changing my voice from an academic voice to a narrative voice was by far the hardest. And probably the thing that I had the least amount of confidence in. And I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, a small black town in Louisiana. I had all black teachers. I went to all black schools. I went to Grambling and to Howard. So I have a healthy share of bravado. I can do most things. I got real good self-esteem. I had so little confidence in my ability to be able to do this. I thought, I don't know, because narrative prose, like, you know things. And as an academic, you are trained to always cite, like always stand back. You're the observer and you're telling this story in a way that you're probing. So I say all of that to say, as I matured as a scholar and going to conferences in spaces where I could be more myself, and less of the kind of stale, here's the thesis, here are the points that I'm arguing, here's the counter argument, here's why you should believe me. Moving away from that into College Language Association conferences, Toni Morrison Association, Toni Morrison Society conferences, and just different spaces, I was able to be both scholarly and kind of casual at the same time. So the 50th anniversary of the Phyllis Wheatley conference that Margaret Walker convened at Jackson State happened, and I think I co-organized the panel. I was working with this panel like on literary friendships, Black women literary friendships. And so I wanted to talk about Toni Morrison's literary friendship with June Jordan, with Barbara Chase Rabeau, and with Lucille Clifton. So I had to write a whole new paper because I had these kind of traditional chapters that were going on. Read the paper, and I'm doing the paper around like why Morrison is able to get out of Lucille Clifton generations when the other editors had not been able to get generations. This book about her matriarchal history, like why that can happen, why she can work with June Jordan as a writer who is somewhere else and then also try to feed her information about like what press looks like. Why she can move Barbara Chase Rabeau from being a sculptor into being a poet and being recognized as a poet and so on. Telling that story in a way for that audience made me say, okay, this is how I'm going to tell the story. This is about literary friendships. So let me tell this story about how they were friends and what the tensions were with the friends and so on. I finished the paper, and it's it's factual. It is storytelling, but it's also got enough tea in it that at the question and answer period, like I get most of the questions. And so coming up after people are talking to me about it, at the end of the line is Abby West. I had met Abby. Abby and I had been corresponding on email, and we had probably seen each other in Zoom. I'm sure we had seen each other, but like I look up and I go, hi, how are you? And she says, hey Dana, I'm Abby. And I'm like, hi Abby. And I'm like, Abby, come on, what do you teach? What do you, like, what's your story? Like, what's up? And she's like, West. And I go, oh snap, I'm so glad I didn't know that she was there, because it would have been like a different kind of energy. And she says, that's the voice. So I told this very long story to say it was only when Abby was like, that's the voice, it's that. And because I was talking about friendships and I wasn't talking about structure and paragraphs and rhythm and like I wasn't talking about the formal things. I was like, oh, I can do that voice. Like, that's my voice. So she's like, that's the voice for trade. And almost like magic, I started to rewrite chapters. I was like, okay. And I learned you need, like, what's the hook for the chapter? What are you trying to tell in this chapter? What's the rising point of the chapter? And how is it going to transition into the other? Once I saw that that's what I was trying to do, then it got to be a little bit easier. But my natural disposition in writing now is still academic and then translate. I'm looking forward to the moment when I can go straight, this is reporter, this is journalist, this is storyteller. Because I'm telling you, that translation is tough. I admire people who can do it like firsthand. Like it's a beautiful thing, but for me it is challenging but rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a beautiful story for you to tell about Abby really pointing out and lighting the way for you. And so I'd love to give this opportunity to you to talk a little bit about your own writer-editor relationship. I know that there were multiple people who had a hand in bringing this book to life, but how meaningful was it to work with an editor like Abby West, who I personally know we worked in magazines together at Time Inc. back in the day. We even used to ride the train in together into the city sometimes. And she spoke to my students when I was teaching magazine writing at Rutgers like over 10 years ago. So Abby holds a special place in my heart as well. But I'd love to hear your experience working with her and what that editor-writer relationship is like, given that you are writing a book about editor-writer relationships.
It was really important. I don't know. I mean, I talked about it in passing, but I know that she wasn't aware that I was very upset about the different editors that have been assigned to this book. So Tracy Sherrod acquired the book. Tracy and I had a relationship. Tracy would come to Howard each year to talk to students about publishing. And I talked to Tracy, like I said, hey, I want to have a conversation with you where we're not talking in your professional capacity at Amistad. We're talking like black girl to black girl. Here's where we are. Here's where I am with this book. What do you think? Can you give me some advice? And she said, well, what you're asking for is specifically something that would happen with really an agent. I can give you I'll give you what you need, but this is a conversation that you would have with an agent. And shout out to Paula Giddings, who shortly after Morrison died said, Dana, if you don't get an agent for this book in the next month, I'm going to get an agent for this book for you. Mm-hmm. I'm an academic. I'm not thinking about an agent in a book. I'm thinking like, I will do this the way that I did every other book that I worked on that was an academic. So I understood that I should get an agent for the book. Tracy and I talked through like what the expectations were. Tracy, of course, went to Little Brown at the time. So the book was assigned to Jen Baker. Jen is unceremoniously dismissed from Amistad, at which point I'm livid. I'm like, I'm writing a book about black women editors and y'all are hemorrhaging black women editors. Like, I don't know what. So the politics of it, and I told you, I grew up in black spaces. I work in a black space. I'm not the most politically correct person. I'm like, I will, whatever. I don't have to be here with this book. Like, if you can't find a black woman to work with me on this book, then I can take this book somewhere else. And at this point, I'm like 15 years in. What's another 2 or 3 years, right? So I'm having this conversation. Then Daniela Wexler gets assigned to the book, and Daniela gives me some good feedback. Enough to make me say, okay, and I'm of the August Wilson ilk, because I told you, remember I did black theater at first. I'm like, I want a black director. That's my August Wilson stand. I want a black editor for this book. So Daniela goes to work on the MFA, and I say to myself, if this book isn't assigned a black editor, I really am ending this contract. And ultimately, Abby gets the book, in part because I think they understand the importance of the book, but I guess something made them say, we have to assign this book to a black woman editor. And I'm glad that they did, and I'm glad that Abby took the time to come to Jackson. I mean, the conference was full. I mean, it was beautiful. It's Eve Ewing, it's Jasmine Ward, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I mean, it was clearly like good that she's there. She's clearly not just there for me, but I'm glad that she's said, okay, I gotta go because one of my writers is here and I need to meet her and like have this opportunity. So her humility as somebody who's like the whole head of a publishing company saying, I'm gonna stand and wait and not text me and say, meet me for lunch at whatever time or meet me for whatever. So like, let me just hear. I appreciated that. I appreciated that she really understood what I was trying to do. And finally, I'll say the thing that I think is most beautiful about Abby, interestingly enough, is she empowers other people to do incredible work. Mm-hmm. So Michaela Tabron, who was a Howard student who I had taught in freshman seminar at Howard, it's a class of 750, so we don't have a like one-on-one relationship, but who I see like in a gas station parking lot one day who says, Dr. Williams, I know that you work in publishing. My sister keeps telling me to talk to you, and I've been too, whatever, to email you. So the fact that I'm seeing you here at this gas station means I'm supposed to talk to you about this. And I'm like, Michaela, I know a million people in publishing. Don't not ask me to help you if this is what you want to do. Mm-hmm. She sends me her resume. I send it over to a couple of people, to some agencies. So she ends up at Amistad and ends up being the editorial assistant for the book.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Abby just says, it's yours. This is as much your baby. So Michaela and I are going back and forth. And I appreciate the fact that Abby entrusted Michaela enough to say, you guys, I'm going to give you my big feedback, and then you guys come to whatever conclusions you have. We're going to work with legal. But Michaela was as instrumental too in those probing questions as we think about ideas like this, where Morrison says, sometimes a point is too unburied. So as I'm talking about Charles Harris, who goes to Howard, she's like, hey, you're hinting that there's a reason why he leaves Random House. You got to tell us why. So probing questions that both Michaela and Abby were able to do. So it was important to me to have folks who understood what was going on work on the book. And then important to me to be able to have a kind of confidence in their belief in me and the book and the work as well. Mm-hmm. So it's just been a wonderful experience all around. There isn't a single living author who I contacted who did not say yes immediately to conversations. So it's just been wonderful all around to have so much support for people to talk about such an important part of Morrison's life. And I'm just looking forward to a really wonderful ride with this book that I hope helps us to think in African American literature and culture how things come to be and what's possible if people are in the right position to be able to make things possible.
Well, shout out to Abby West at Amistad. I'm so glad that she was able to be a steward of this work for you. Yeah, and I could talk to you forever, Dana, because I have all the questions.
Well, we'll go with episode 2.
Yeah, all the tea.
We'll go with episode 2 whenever you're ready.
Right now, all I'm going to say is thank you, Dana. Dana A. Williams, thank you so much for your time and for writing Toni at Random, the iconic writer's legendary editorship. This is very much a book that is needed, and I'm so glad that it is here and we get to really dive into a part of Toni Morrison's career that we don't talk enough about. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share and for all of the work that you're doing and have done. I appreciate it tremendously because it's the behind the scenes work. It's the advocacy. It's the audience building. It's the culture keeping that makes all of the difference in the world. And I don't take that lightly. So thank you for all of your work.